Something appeared on that stage that should not have been possible. Not a trick of lighting, not an actor in costume, not a shadow thrown against a painted backdrop. Something that moved with intention, that occupied real space, that turned toward the crowd as though it could hear them. And the crowd, 60,000 people standing in the dark of a California desert, responded the only way a human body knows how to respond when it sees something it cannot explain. It went silent first, then it came undone. The year was 2012. The festival was Coachella. The figure on the stage was Tupac Shakur, a man who had been shot and killed on a Las Vegas street in September of 1996. He was 25 years old when he died. He was, by any definition available to reason, gone. And yet there he stood, moving, speaking, raising one arm toward the sky while the crowd below him fractured between grief and astonishment. The word the industry reached for was hologram. It is a word that carries weight. It suggests the future. It suggests laboratories and lasers, patents filed in the current decade, technology so advanced it sits just at the boundary of what ordinary minds can follow. But the word was wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. What appeared on that stage in the California desert was built on a principle first demonstrated to a paying audience in the winter of 1862 in a gas-lit theater in London by a Victorian chemist named John Henry Pepper. And if you follow that thread far enough, it does not simply lead back to a curious footnote in the history of entertainment. It leads somewhere considerably more interesting than that. To understand what was truly standing on that stage at Coachella, you have to leave California entirely and cross an ocean. You have to go back not decades, but generations, to a Britain that was running on coal smoke and imperial confidence, where science and showmanship had only recently discovered that they needed one another. The year is 1854. The Royal Polytechnic Institution stands on Regent Street in London, a building that occupies a peculiar and important space in Victorian intellectual life. It is not a university. It is not exactly a museum. It is something harder to classify. A place where science was performed for the public, where the emerging discoveries of the industrial age were translated into spectacle, made legible to audiences who did not read academic journals but who would pay a shilling to see the future made visible. The Polytechnic had hosted some of the earliest public demonstrations of photography. It had shown Londoners a working model of a submarine diving bell. It was, in the language of its era, a house of wonders. Into this institution in 1854 came a man named John Henry Pepper. He was 31 years old, formally trained as an analytical chemist, and possessed of a quality that pure science often regards with some suspicion. He was genuinely entertaining. He understood that knowledge, however rigorous, required presentation, that the gap between discovery and public understanding was not simply a matter of information, it was a matter of theater. Pepper rose quickly within the institution. He became its director. He gave popular lectures. He wrote books for general audiences about chemistry, about the natural world, about the scientific principles concealed inside ordinary life. He was, in every sense, a communicator. But the work that would attach his name permanently to the history of illusion began not with any original discovery of his own, but with a pamphlet he received from another man entirely. That man was Henry Dirks, a civil engineer by profession and an amateur theatrical inventor by compulsion. Dirks had spent years developing a theoretical system for producing transparent apparitions on a stage. His concept was geometrically elegant. By concealing an actor beneath or beside the stage, bathing that actor in brilliant light, and angling a large sheet of glass so that it caught the actor's reflection and projected it onto the performance space, a figure could appear to occupy the stage without physically being there. Translucent, luminous, apparently real, and apparently impossible in the same instant. Dirks had tried to sell the idea to London theaters for years. He had written his pamphlet, circulated it, sought investors, sought builders. Every theater he approached told him the same thing. The apparatus he required, a concealed pit of specific dimensions, permanent alterations to the stage floor and front-of-house geometry, was too expensive, too permanent, too impractical. The idea was sound, the engineering was sound, but no one would build it. Then the pamphlet reached Pepper, and Pepper, who understood theater in a way that Dirks perhaps did not, saw immediately what needed to change. Not the principle was correct. What needed to change was the scale, the permanence, the complexity. Pepper took Dirks's elaborate architectural requirement and reduced it to something portable, something that could be installed in an existing theater without demolition. A large sheet of plate glass, angled at the right degree, mounted on a frame that could be moved. The actor beneath the stage replaced by an actor in a concealed space at the front of the house, lit by a focused beam of intense artificial light. The geometry remained identical, the ghost remained identical, but the machine producing it had become something a working theater could actually use. On the 24th of December, 1862, the audience that filled the Royal Polytechnic Institution for the Christmas season performance had been told they would see a dramatic adaptation of Charles Dickens. The specific work chosen was The Haunted Man, which Pepper had selected with the precision of a man who understood his audience entirely. Dickens was beloved, Christmas was sacred, and ghost stories were, in Victorian England, not merely entertainment. They were a seasonal tradition with roots that went deeper than anyone present would have comfortably examined. The performance began without incident. The actors moved through their paces. The gas footlights cast their characteristic warm amber glow across the boards. The house was full and comfortable, warm against the December street outside. And then the moment came, the moment the script required a ghost. What the audience expected was a man in white fabric, perhaps backlit, perhaps accompanied by a sound effect and a theatrical flourish. What they received was something that caused the first 3 rows of the audience to physically recoil in their seats. The figure appeared in the middle of the stage, among the living actors. It was translucent. It was self-luminous in a way that no actor under any lighting arrangement could replicate. When one of the living performers moved through the space the apparition occupied, he passed directly through it without interruption. The figure neither moved aside nor collapsed. It simply continued to exist, undisturbed, in the same space as a solid human body. For a theater audience in 1862, there was no frame of reference for this. Photography existed, but was still largely a novelty. Motion pictures would not exist for another 30 years. The idea of projecting an image, of separating a figure from its physical substrate, was not yet part of the cultural vocabulary. What they were seeing had no name and no category, and the human nervous system, confronted with the nameless, does not reason, it reacts. The theater was, by multiple contemporary accounts, briefly ungovernable. People stood, some moved toward the exits. A woman in the gallery fainted, which the papers of the following day reported with a mixture of concern and barely concealed delight. And then, as the figure faded and the lights came up slightly, the understanding began to settle in. This was deliberate. This was a demonstration. This was not, in fact, supernatural.
And the relief that followed the fear transformed itself, as it always does in such circumstances, into something resembling ecstasy. The applause was reported to have continued for several minutes. Pepper stepped forward at the end of the performance and explained in broad terms what the audience had witnessed. He showed them the glass. He demonstrated the angle. He revealed the concealed actor who had been the source of the reflection. He was generous with the explanation. Transparency, he seemed to understand, did not diminish the wonder. In some important way, knowing how it worked made it more astonishing, because the distance between a man in a pit and a ghost on a stage was so vast, so counterintuitive, so quietly radical, that the explanation itself became a kind of spectacle. The technique was patented in 1863, with Dirks acknowledged as co-inventor following pressure from colleagues who had watched the negotiations carefully. The patent described it as an improvement in the mode of exhibiting dramatic pieces. The press, with greater poetry, called it Pepper's Ghost, and within 18 months the apparatus had been licensed to theaters across Britain, adapted for use in Paris, exported to New York, and installed in entertainment venues from Edinburgh to Melbourne.
Now we follow the thread forward, past the Victorian drawing rooms and the gaslit stages, through a century of cinema and radio and television, through the entire revolution of electronic media, to a tent in the California desert and a digital ghost standing before 60,000 living people. The company responsible for the Coachella apparition was Digital Domain, a visual effects firm based in Venice, California, with a substantial reputation built on film work. Their team spent months on the production. They studied archival footage of Tupac, thousands of hours of it. They analyzed his movement, his posture, the specific quality of his physical presence on stage. They built a digital model of extraordinary sophistication, rendering each element of the figure from scratch using motion capture principles derived from existing footage and, in some areas, from entirely fabricated movement constructed to match what the real man's body would have done. The cost figures that circulated in press coverage ranged from $100,000 to $400,000 for the rendering work alone. The total production cost was reported to be considerably higher. The digital artistry was genuine, the computational complexity was real. None of this is in question. But then there is the matter of delivery. All of that rendering, all of that motion capture and digital reconstruction and computational labor had to be put somewhere. It had to be made visible to 60,000 people standing outdoors, in varying positions, at varying distances from a stage. And the mechanism selected for that delivery, the system that placed the digital image in that space, in that light, before that crowd, was a sheet of transparent mylar film, stretched taut and angled at a precise degree above the stage surface, onto which a high-powered projector threw the rendered image from below. The image struck the film reflected it forward and upward. The audience saw it appear to occupy three-dimensional space on the stage. This is Pepper's Ghost, not a metaphorical descendant of Pepper's Ghost, not an evolution so distant as to require a new name. It is the same principle, the same geometry, the same optical relationship between a concealed image source and an angled reflective surface that John Henry Pepper demonstrated to a London audience on Christmas Eve 1862. The materials have changed, the image source has changed beyond recognition, but the architecture of the illusion is identical. The same pattern repeated in May of 2014 at the Billboard Music Awards in Las Vegas, when a digital reconstruction of Michael Jackson performed a posthumous concert for a live audience and a television viewership in the tens of millions. Again, the coverage centered on digital artistry.
Again, the delivery mechanism was the same angled reflective surface, the same Victorian geometry, producing the same effect it had produced in a gas-lit theater 150 years before.
There are details in this story that resist easy settlement. They do not point toward any single conclusion, but they are worth examining carefully. The first is the word that was chosen: hologram. It is, in the strict technical sense, the wrong word by a considerable margin. A true hologram is a photographic recording of a light field, reproduced in a way that creates genuine three-dimensional visual information visible from multiple angles without distortion. True holographic display technology has existed in laboratory settings for decades, but as of the date of the Coachella performance and for years afterward, it had not been successfully scaled to live performance applications. What was used at Coachella could not be viewed from the side without the illusion collapsing. It had a strict viewing angle, a front-facing sweet spot beyond which the effect disappeared entirely. This is the opposite of how a hologram behaves. The word hologram was used anyway, by the production company, by the press, by the musicians and presenters and cultural commentators who discussed the performances in the days and weeks that followed. It was used so consistently and so universally that it became, functionally, the accepted description of the technology regardless of its technical inaccuracy. This matters because words are not neutral containers. The word hologram places the technology firmly in the future. It places it in the realm of the unprecedented, the cutting edge, the barely yet possible. The phrase "Pepper's ghost" places it somewhere else entirely. It places it in a Victorian theater on Regent Street, beside a man in a pit wearing white fabric while a stagehand aims a lamp at him. One of these framings invites awe, the other invites a different kind of attention entirely. The second anomaly is the teleprompter, because the same principle, the same angle, the same ghost in the same glass is simultaneously embedded in one of the most ubiquitous pieces of communication technology in the modern world. Every president who has delivered a televised address in the last 40 years has done so through a Pepper's ghost apparatus. The transparent glass panel mounted in front of the camera, angled at the precise degree that reflects the scrolling text of the speech toward the speaker's eyes while remaining invisible to the lens behind it, is direct optical descendant of the 1863 patent. The speaker appears to be looking into the eyes of the nation. They are looking at a reflected image. This is not a criticism of teleprompters. They are functional tools that serve legitimate purposes. But it is worth sitting with the coincidence, if coincidence is what it is, that the same Victorian optical trick has found its way into both the concert stage and the political podium, both the space of spectacle and the space of authority. In both contexts, it is doing the same fundamental work, creating the impression of presence where the reality of presence is more complicated than it appears. The archives contain testimony from those who stood in those early audiences, and some of it reads with a familiarity that crosses the century between their era and ours. A writer for the Illustrated London News, reviewing the Pepper's Ghost demonstrations in early 1863, described an experience that no purely technical account quite captures. He noted that the intellectual understanding of the trick, which Pepper had explained quite openly, did nothing to quiet what he described as a physical unease in the chest. He wrote that the body does not accept reassurances as readily as the mind, that something in the human frame continues to respond to the apparition as though it were real, regardless of what the reasoning faculties have been told. A diary, quoted in academic literature on Victorian theatrical technology from the 1970s, belongs to a woman named Clara Ashworth, who attended a Pepper's Ghost production at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly in the spring of 1864. She wrote that the figure on stage had caused her to think, entirely irrationally and without any resemblance to justify it, of her late brother. She recorded that she had left before the curtain fell, not from fright, she was careful to note, but from a feeling she described with the careful syntax of a person reaching for language that does not yet exist, as the sensation of standing in a room where the proportions are not quite right. Across an ocean and a century and a half, a young woman interviewed at Coachella the morning after Tupac's appearance described the experience in terms that settle uncomfortably close to Ashworth's. She said she had not expected to feel anything beyond excitement. She said she had ended up weeping. She said she was still uncertain the following morning what she had actually been weeping about, whether it was grief for a specific person or something less specific, something about the quality of the image itself, the way it moved, the way it occupied space it had no right to occupy. Between those two accounts lies everything that changed in the world between 1864 and 2012, and what did not change is the thing worth looking at. There is a concept in the history of technology sometimes described as the persistence of form. It holds that certain mechanisms, once established, do not simply endure because they work. They endure because they fit something in the human perceptual system so precisely that alternative approaches cannot displace them. The wheel is the obvious example, but the wheel is almost too obvious. The more interesting cases are the less visible ones, the mechanisms that operate beneath the surface of daily life, unexamined because they have been present so long that examination feels unnecessary. Pepper's Ghost is one of these mechanisms. It has been in continuous use, in one form or another, in one context or another, since 1862. It has moved from theatrical entertainment to political communication to popular spectacle and back again, adapting its materials, updating its image sources, but retaining the essential geometry that Pepper worked out in a Regent Street laboratory more than 160 years ago. What that geometry exploits is specific and worth naming directly. The human visual system is designed, by long evolutionary pressure, to interpret certain cues as indicating the presence of a solid, real object occupying real space. One of those cues is the appearance of an object being lit from the same light source as the surrounding environment. Another is the appearance of an object casting appropriate shadow. A third is the appearance of an object being viewed from an angle consistent with the viewer's position. Pepper's Ghost satisfies enough of these cues that the visual system draws its conclusion before the reasoning mind has time to intervene. This is not a vulnerability in the human perceptual system, it is a feature of it. The brain is not a camera, it is an interpreter. It assembles reality from partial information, makes rapid probabilistic judgments, and presents those judgments to consciousness as direct perception. It is extraordinarily efficient and extraordinarily good at its task, but it can be addressed. It can be given information calibrated to produce a specific conclusion. And the question that Pepper's Ghost raises, quietly, without drama, simply by existing for as long as it has in the places it has occupied, is this: who decides what information to place in the glass? John Henry Pepper died in 1900 at the age of 76 in Brisbane, Australia, far from the Regent Street institution where he had built his reputation. By the time of his death, the theatrical technique that bore his name had spread to every English-speaking country on Earth and several beyond it. He had spent the final decades of his life lecturing, demonstrating, explaining. He was not a secretive man. He believed, sincerely and demonstrably, in the public understanding of science. He wanted people to know how the trick worked. And yet the trick outlived his explanations by more than a century. Not because anyone suppressed the explanation, not because there was a deliberate effort to keep the principle concealed, but because in each new context where it appeared, the explanation was simply not the story that was told. The story that was told was the effect, the ghost, the figure on the stage, the face of the dead made briefly, impossibly present. So we are left with questions that do not resolve into comfortable answers. Why, in a culture saturated with information, in an era when the explanation of any mechanism is available within seconds to anyone with a device in their pocket, did the word hologram become the accepted description of something that was demonstrably and precisely Pepper's ghost? Was it ignorance? Was it the path of least resistance for journalists working quickly against a deadline? Or was there something in the word itself, something in its implications of novelty and futurity that served a purpose? What does it mean that the same optical illusion sits at the center of both the concert stage and the political address? That the technology used to make a dead musician appear to speak is structurally identical to the technology used to make a living leader appear to look you in the eye? Is that a coincidence of engineering, or is it something that a more careful kind of attention might find worth examining? And what do we make of the body's response? Of Clara Ashworth leaving a Victorian theater with a feeling she could not name? Of a generation of young people weeping in a California desert at an image they knew to be artificial, responding to it with a grief that did not seem to know the difference between the real and the reflected? Maybe the answer is simple. Maybe Pepper's ghost endures because it works, and it works because human perception is what it is, and there is no deeper pattern to find, only a useful piece of geometry and the long history of our willingness to be moved by what we see. Or maybe the people who stood in those early Victorian theaters, watching a figure appear in the middle of a lit stage with no explanation they could reach for, understood something about the nature of images and presence and the space between them that we have since learned to forget. Maybe the ghost was never in the glass. Maybe the ghost was always in us, waiting for someone to aim the light correctly.